So Bitsports was, for all intents and purposes, a rocket ship. We had the money, the marketing, the customers, and the technology. So why didn't it launch on Chia, and what ended up happening? I'm really happy to have Adam joining me here. So Adam and I are the co-founders of Irolast, and Irolast was the company, and is the company, continues to exist, that worked on Bitsports. So what happened was, when we were contacted by the team at Bitsports as they were starting to formulate how they wanted to get this project going, they approached us and they said, "Hey, let's build this thing together. Help us to get this thing launched." And so when Adam and I first contemplated how we were going to get this done, we had to formulate an entire tech strategy. And I figured we could just sort of go through some of the stuff that happened that ended up making this project not launch correctly. So Adam, welcome to the stage. Welcome to the show. I don't know if you want to give us just a quick introduction to yourself, and then we'll dive into it.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm much like you. I've kind of been in the IT tech space for about 20 years. Taught myself how to code on the Apple II when I was a little fifth grader. Been in blockchain for a long time, and about, I want to say, maybe 5 years ago, maybe four, we started Earlast, and we focused primarily on blockchain development and consulting for people. And yeah, it's been a blast, and it's always interesting to see what happens to some of these companies like Bitsports and how we handle them. So
Our first thought on building Bitsports was they really needed a platform. If we were going to onboard all of these different football teams, they were all going to need specific infrastructure. They were going to need things that were particular to them. And a lot of this was, we needed to turn the crank and stamp out copies. So I remember when we first started building that platform, one of the things that we identified was, we are going to need a reliable full node infrastructure that we can talk to. I, coming out of Exodus, knew how important that was for running a wallet. And essentially, these clients were going to be special purpose clients that had to do a lot of things that were similar to what wallets would do. They need to be able to find coins on the Chia blockchain. They need to be able to make RPC calls. We had this idea that we could do this completely independent of a centralized infrastructure, but to make it really fast and functional for the specific needs of Bitsports, running their own full node infrastructure seemed like a fine thing to do. And that's one of the first projects that we started working on. Adam, if you recall, what we did was we tried to make a reliable full node infrastructure for Chia. That ended up becoming bigger than just running Chia infrastructure. As I remember that we said, this is where we're going to start, but we ought to really do this because we run a lot of different nodes. And through trying to get Chia to run reliably, we said, wow, it's kind of nuts that it can't connect to a different database, that we have to use SQLite, which caused a whole bunch of infrastructure downstream complications, if it were.
yeah, so just to kind of explain to people listening, when you're dealing with trying to scale and reliably bring up services very quickly, uh, you want to try to make your services as stateless as possible. But on the other hand, when you're developing a blockchain node, most people say, well, this should be able to run on a Raspberry Pi or something like that. And so a lot of these chain developers use state stores like SQLite that are very, very cumbersome to deal with in a cloud infrastructure. So what we had done was we put in an abstraction layer throughout this Chia code base to say, hey, if you want to run SQLite, that's great. There's a use case for that. But what if I want to run on, a more robust, distributed data storage service? Like, it could just be as simple as a Postgres server or MySQL server. And so we had done that and submitted that back to the team. And yeah, it was interesting to see the very shocking responses from the Chia staffers on those pull requests there. They weren't having it.
I remember that. And they did not understand why we would want to run it this way, and said even further, they wanted to move away from SQLite and use flat files. That actually never came into play, but Yeah, definitely. It was surprising to see that they didn't want the Chia full node to be able to connect to a modern database. Like that PR was just resoundingly rejected. Like we had some back and forth on the pull request. It's still out there too. I'll put it in the show notes. So if anyone wants to go take a look at it. Yeah, but it didn't go anywhere. And I would say that that first interaction that we had to try to make an improvement to the full node was sort of the thing that resonated throughout the rest of the project. That should have been our first big warning sign that this probably wouldn't go the way that we wanted it to. But we had hope even after this went the way that it did.
Yeah, and it was just depressing in a way because, the developers who are from CNI who were commenting on that pull request, they're smart people, but as you know, when you work in this industry, there's so much to know where you end up only knowing a lot of things about your niche. And it was kind of at least evident to me, if this is just my opinion, that this was not their niche. And they were just saying very, um, unambiguously that what we were wrong. And we were bringing in other developers who were also familiar with cloud infrastructure or world renowned to get in to comment there and say, no, this is why we do this. But yeah, they were just very stubborn in their thinking.
So that didn't go as well as we wanted it to. The next thing that we identified that we needed to do was to start working on the client. And Flutter was a choice of Bitsports, and it ended up intersecting well with some tech that was already out there. That was the basis for Chia Crypto Utils. That module actually existed with that specific name, and it was authored originally by Rigidity as part of the digital farming initiative. So we took that on and started to move it forward. That was another piece of tech that we had identified that we thought, well, if there are going to be clients that are out there in the world and they're going to want to build on top of Chia and they're going to want to try to do things, why reinvent the wheel? Why not make some sort of an infrastructure that existed that other people could leverage, that they could use to accelerate development? It would be a wallet SDK, a place to start that did most of the easy stuff, and that would be a good pattern for how everything would work. And one of the first things that we needed to do that didn't exist inside of Chia Crypto Utils was add support for cats, because cats had just come out. That was fairly newish tech that had gotten launched and that was out and available, and we needed to add support for it. So we started asking CNI for some help with adding support for cats, and that didn't go super well either. I don't. Do you remember how that effort went, Adam? Did you have a chance to interact much with our development team when we were trying to add cat support into Chia Crypto Utils?
I mean, I was only kind of working on the sidelines when we were doing that part, but my take on it is I can see the arguments either way, like why you shouldn't use Flutter, but honestly, it made sense for where CNI was, where they wanted to expand their ecosystem. And it's a perfectly good and great platform for when you want to do mobile development. And honestly, the thing that was kind of frustrating was, on one hand, with the previous pull request we talked about, they said, oh, these need to work on small devices. But yet when we came to Flutter, which is designed to work on small mobile devices, they just weren't interested in helping support that. And throughout this time, you and me, Grant, like running Aerolast, we're paying for this development. It's not like there's just a bunch of volunteers, writing some code and hoping someone takes it and funds us later. Like, we're paying for this out of pocket, trying to improve the ecosystem. And it just didn't seem like, we were cool enough kids based on the tech decisions, because the CNI devs didn't really agree with them.
And we did have funding within Bitsports. I think that that's another thing that's really important to talk about here, is that this was a VC backed company. So Bitsports had already secured funding. Like they they had money when they first approached us and they wanted to work with us. And then a major VC that would later end up, continuously backing the company that Bitsports became after it pivoted away from this entire idea. And that's very common in the world of startups, is that you think you're going to do something and then you pivot. It was not obvious that we were going to pivot off of the idea here. So when this VC came into the mix, we had completed a seed round, and it was a funded company and had the stated intention of launching on Chia. And it was pouring money into developing the ecosystem of Chia, helping to fund this reliable full node infrastructure that would run its own internal operations, that it was building an open source client SDK along with Irrelast. So we're working on this in conjunction, and a lot of what we're doing, we're putting back in as open source contributions into the Chia crypto utils ecosystem, so that we can get this special purpose client launched. So we have the money and we have the tech, but there's not great buy-in from Chia at this point that we're a company that they're interested in helping. And I would say that it was kind of these first two projects that we kind of worked on, that we tried to draw in Chia to help us. I remember also at this time that we had deep experience working with Ethereum. We had extensively worked with Truffle and Ganache, and one of the things that we wanted to have available to us was some sort of testing infrastructure. So this was the first time when we tried to get the simulator to work. So this is the point at which in the tech development that we're trying to get the simulator working, that we're trying to get cats working, that we're trying to use the simulator to prove that we have cats working correctly in Chia crypto utils. And we're still just feeling like we're beating our head against the wall. We're making good progress on the entire platform. So we're trying to move this forward as quickly as we can in every direction, but we're just sort of finding a hard wall at climbing over what would be required to get all of the Chia tech completely functional. And I'd say that this was also in the middle of COVID, when it was not entirely clear what was going to happen with this pandemic that was happening, because this was in the beginning of 2022. The first months of that was when a lot of this development was happening fast and furious. Another project that we started working on was, as the ideas of how Bitsports would launch started to come to more granularity, as we would start to understand better what we were doing with the launch of these teams, building fan tokens, and also doing everything that we had anticipated doing with NFTs, we started to realize how important doing some kind of market impact analysis and data science projects and tokenomics would be, to ensure that we could properly liquidize the market. Adam, do you remember when we were working on some of the data science stuff that would be the first tokenomics infrastructure and analysis around Chia?
Yeah, we had brought in someone who had worked in the financial sector for a long time, very top person. The guy was a wizard when it came to doing things in R and things like that, to do these analyses. And he was doing all sorts of things like running Monte Carlo simulations and so on and so forth, really showing like, here, this is what the tokenomics will look like. You see a lot of these blockchain projects where someone just kind of pulls some numbers out of their hat and says, well, here's the tokenomics of something, but they're really just a cap table. And we had actually done the effort to show, like, given the usage pattern and the supply here, this is what the price should be and how it'll maintain there, just to make sure that people don't get rugged in the end. Because in the end of the day, you want to make sure that there's actual utility or value, either or. Better if you can have both in these coins or tokens. And that was a significant effort that not a lot of people in the world can do. And honestly, I have not even seen hardly any tokens or projects out in the Web3 ecosystem that does that. So that was kind of amazing that we were able to do that. And with the way Bitsports went, we weren't able to really showcase that.
So when we were thinking about how we would use NFTs, so Bitsports, when it first got started, it was all about tokens, but always had the idea, since in 2022 NFTs were very big. They were super popular on Ethereum, and Bitsports' idea of NFTs was to make essentially trading cards, like sports trading cards. And so the sports trading cards would have a picture of the athlete, would have attributes, and these NFTs we had the idea that you could use them in like a fantasy football style game. So there was a gaming aspect that Bitsports had, as well as ticketing. So NFTs would be used for collectibles, and then that there would be NFTs that would allow the sports teams to take control of ticketing and entering the actual sports arenas, because that was something that we really felt, and that the team at Bitsports that really knew the sports teams well, and that's another part that I want to get into in a second about just like how we had the market, that they felt that this was an area that the teams were really interested in, that they wanted to take on ticketing. So if we start with just the collectibles, if you think about how that might work, at the time there was a lot of white lists, there were bidding, there were auctions, all of the kind of infrastructure that OpenSea had brought into the mix of how desirable NFTs could actually be sold to people that wanted to own them. In Chia, it was really interesting because you could do that with offer files, and so you could have this really interesting way to auction things off and leveraging the tech that existed. And we felt that it was a really interesting way to approach the problem. But if you think about how that would work with offer files, if bidders are going to bid on NFTs, they need the currency to bid on them with, which was XCH. And as we started to look at how many bidders might we have, how many NFTs do we think we're going to sell? What is the price of the NFT? And how would this all work? And how would we liquidize the market? We quickly realized that we were going to need to have a way to get access to a significant amount of XCH. And it wasn't obvious that that would be easy to do. So, liquidizing the market and the market impact model around how we would actually put XCH into the hands of thousands of people that wanted to bid on NFTs in this ecosystem using offer files was not obvious. And that was another thing that we reached out into Chia to try to figure out how we could do it. And that didn't go that well either. It seemed like a use case for the pre-farm, maybe. Like if we were able to get some of that Chia into the hands of people and somehow have, a future on it or something. But if that spiked the price of Chia and we had to return the Chia as Chia, it could have a significant impact on Bitsports itself if we were to try to take that on, use some of the money that we had raised to provide liquidity into the market. So that was like another big effort that we had gone through in the market impact modeling and the tokenomics around how we could actually get this thing to work. And it was a significant challenge to contemplate how we could put our hands on enough Chia to make our NFT auctions work correctly. Because going out and buying them on the open market just it seemed like we would impact the price substantively, and at that time there just wasn't that much Chia to go around.
But on the same token, and I remember this from David's economic or tokenomic simulations, was, if that could work, it would have been a huge driving force in Chia. Like Chia would not be where it is today if this was successful, just because of the demand and the liquidity that would have been needed. Because when you're talking about the number of football teams Bitsports was talking to, they weren't just talking to a couple of clubs. They were talking to, if I remember right, that it was like close to 100 around the world, mostly in Europe and South America. And so you count all those fans in there, and there's a serious liquidity crunch that would have really affected the price. And it would have been a really good thing for the network if we had some, better support from CNI.
And I remember when we were talking with Chia about like how this market might shape up, and saying that if everything were priced in Chia, and that if we were to have launched so that offer files were only priced in Chia, that you would be bidding in Chia, that there would be a demand for Chia, because you would be using it as a currency to do a fundamental operation. There would be a built-in demand because there would be a first sale of these NFTs. there would potentially be a secondary sale where royalties would be generated. And we calculated this all up. Like, we figured out how the sale of the NFTs, how the market as it would develop might progress through first and secondary sales, what the royalty might be, how the royalty would be enforced. And it was significant for the company as a source of revenue. So we really wanted to make this thing work correctly, but that we also just didn't quite find the support in the way that we needed to make this happen. I remember having some conversations with big holders of Chia, and at the time everyone was very reluctant to part with any of their Chia in any substantive way. It was really viewed as this is a valuable commodity. It's going to go up in value. And so we just met a lot of resistance around trying to liquidize the market with Chia. And I think that's when the idea that there would be some kind of a cat that could be used instead, and that really started to unravel the entire project right there, is introducing not just Chia, but like cats into the mix, and somehow that was going to be the way that we would make the market work. And it delayed things, and it caused a second round of us having technical conversations with the VCs. And this is when the VCs started to really start asking questions about how much support we were getting from Chia and whether this was the right chain. And they had a vested interest in Solana, which at the outset of the project was a top contender for where Bitsports would launch. Like, Solana was a top contender. And so now the VC stepped in and started, having conversations with the top leadership at Bitsports and saying, looks like you've picked the wrong chain. You really ought to switch to a different one because you're not getting the support. It doesn't look like this is going to work. You should switch to Solana. I recall those days, and not fondly, Adam. I don't know if you remember when we brought that message back, but it was pretty disheartening to hear that the VC wanted to make a switch to a different chain.
Well, and you mentioned this on the first part of this was, you know, the Bitsports team themselves were the ones who really got sold on Chia and really wanted to work and learn it there. And we came in to support them. And, Earlast, our company, we work with every blockchain. We have expertise in doing them all. And when those VCs basically demanded from the Bitsports leadership team that you have to drop Chia, we ended up being blamed for it and thrown under the bus to the point where, all the support we were giving them just went up into smoke. It was kind of shocking, really, because we're willing to help them be successful. This is a company that was positioned to be successful, especially given all the arrangements they made with so many clubs around the world. And just for some VC who had some, and this is just my opinions, who had some personal investments in another chain saying, you will do this and kill everyone who's helping you because you'll do it my way or the highway. You see some VCs out there who basically have their own bag of coins that they want to go up in value, and they'll bully some companies to change for that.
Grant, you mentioned a vested interest, and Adam, you just hinted at maybe it was a personal interest. What sort of relationship did this venture capitalist have with Solana?
They had previous investments in companies that were using Solana, and that they had been using that as a blockchain for other stuff that they were working with. So they had intimate knowledge of Solana, and I don't know this for sure, but I'm fairly confident that there were ties within how Solana was getting launched in a variety of VCs, and it really seemed like they had that inside track on what Solana would ultimately become, and how it was being shepherded forward. And again, this was before the FTX collapse, before any of those things happened. So Solana was looking like the darling of the blockchain industry, being ushered forward by one of the biggest exchanges that existed, and there were a lot of VCs that were all partnered up and camped together try to make that thing happen.
Well, it was certainly the darling at that time, but CNI also had quite a quite a bag at the time, and not just in a pre-farm, but I think they had what 61 million invested into them initially.
Yeah, that $61 million that they got, that was shortly right after mainnet launch. I think it was in the summer of 2021 when they raised money with Richmond Ventures and Andreessen Horowitz. So yeah, they were sitting on a cash hoard.
Well, did that enter into the conversation with Bitsports VC? Was there expectation of getting some sort of incentive or grant from CNI? How did that play into the conversation? I mean, you and Adam have described some of the technical issues with conversations about what your product was going to look like and some of the friction that existed between CNI devs, but what was going on the business development side?
So the Chia cultivation grant program at the time looked like the right vehicle to do things. All the other blockchains in the world were supporting their ecosystem through a variety of grants and things that they would do to inject money into companies that were coming to build on top of their blockchain. As Adam alluded to, we were doing a lot of different blockchain development at Irolast. Terra Luna was a big one for us simultaneously with Bitsports. So we were actually working very, very hard building out other tech when Terra Luna started to collapse. But we had a lot of momentum towards launching a really, really big project on that blockchain. And so we knew how the other blockchain ecosystems were working. And so we thought that the Chia cultivation grant program was a perfect fit for what we were doing at Bitsports. We're a real company. We're VC backed. A little bit of scratch our back and we'll scratch yours sort of a thing that we thought would occur here. But the Chia cultivation grant program, which I think a lot of developers in the Chia ecosystem felt a similar pain, moved ponderously slowly. It was difficult to get any kind of a response out of the individuals that were running the program. It felt like it was just a black hole. We were working very closely with the biz dev team at CNI to try to make progress there, and it just felt like we were hitting a brick wall. We never did end up getting any money out of the Chia cultivation grant program for Bitsports. No matter how much effort we put into it, it just didn't seem like it was getting noticed, or that either they would respond to us and say the backlog is so deep and so heavy that we're just processing through requests in order and you're in the queue, and we didn't get any priority handling no matter how much I tried to escalate it. So even though we were connected with BizDev at Chia, that program didn't come into fruition. And this event that occurred when our VC said you got to use Solana instead, we didn't just take it. We didn't just sit down and say, okay, we're gonna quietly go into that good night. We didn't do that. We fought to try to keep the project on Chia. So we escalated it in every way we possibly could, and that ended up culminating in discussions directly between Chia top leadership and Bitsports top leadership, of which I'm not completely apprised to, because at this point, it's not clear that Irolast is going to continue to get to work on this project, because we're being pushed in a direction to go with Solana, and that's not necessarily a direction that Irolast particularly wanted to take after we built up all this Chia expertise, because we were being courted to do other projects in the space. So it wasn't obvious that we should stop working on Chia and switch to Solana. Also, we gave them the strong indication that switching to Solana would not be a quick move. It would necessarily delay the project significantly, because a lot of what we had built was devoted to Chia, the full node infrastructure, the underlying libraries, the work that we had done on the client. It was all focused on the tech that ultimately worked with Chia. And so just swapping out some other blockchain wasn't a simple operation. And so we really thought that there was an opportunity to salvage it and to try to actually turn the ship and turn the tide. And we brought everything we could to try to make that happen. And ultimately, we're unsuccessful in getting the project back aligned to Chia, and they made the switch, and they decided to start moving forward to try to switch it to Solana.
And you mentioned the VC, but also the leadership in Bitsports. One that they were eager to go with Chia on the outset. But what seemed to change with them? Was it were they frustrated with the experience with Chia, or was it merely the VC putting their foot down and they needed to follow the money to Solana?
I think it was a little bit of both. Honestly, there was frustration around how fast we were getting things done with Chia. There was frustration that we weren't seeing support out of the cultivation grant. The VC was essentially saying, all these experiences that you're having, if you switch to Solana, we know for a fact that that wouldn't be the case because of their previous experience and the experiences that they had with whatever other stuff they had done with Solana. So, I mean, they were very strongly putting their foot down and saying that the experiences you've had are a strong indication that you're in the wrong ecosystem, and that you would have a lot more success if you went somewhere else. So it was them saying, we don't know if we want to support this project financially if you're on this chain, and we think that you're launching into an ecosystem that isn't going to support you in the way that you're going to need, and that's not a great basis for what you're trying to accomplish.
And so the decision was made within Bitsports to follow the demand of the VC and make a switch to Solana. What happened then?
Well, I mean, but I don't want to gloss over that we did try. Like, all efforts were marshaled in the direction of trying to get this thing to stay on Chia. Like, there was a lot of discussion that happened. I think there was a 2-week period where it was constant discussions about whether some kind of arrangement could be made. And again, I'm not fully privy to all the details of exactly how those conversations shaped up, but there was a point at which it was decided that that wasn't going to work, that they weren't going to try to launch this thing on Chia. And when that decision finally got made and they decided to switch to Solana, that's when Irrelast disengaged from the project. Like, we were no longer attached to it in the same way that we had been, and we moved on to something else. to Evergreen is essentially what we turned our eye towards. And I remember, Adam, you and I having the discussion about whether we wanted to stick it out with Solana or we wanted to keep going with Chia. And I think that I was the proponent that we should still keep going with Chia, that we wanted to do it. But there were other business things that happened with Bitsports that made it not obvious that we wanted to keep working with them regardless.
Yeah, from what I kind of remember is, they very suddenly, rightfully or wrongly, pegged the VC's complaints on Chia on us, even though we were kind of following their lead on it. And it made the relationship between Irrelast and Bitsports very awkward because of that. Because, when you're an exec at a company, you don't want to blame yourself. You want to blame someone else. And that's just the mentality there. And we, I personally was willing to do, some work in Solana. I know you weren't, Grant, but in the end of the day, it was very clear that the Bitsports leadership just had a distaste in our mouth and just kind of ended the relationship very suddenly and quickly.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of it in a nutshell, Lucas. What there were a series of things that ended up falling apart in our launching it on Chia. I feel like we had a lot of the stuff that could have made this just a super exciting project. It was slated to launch Q2 of 2022. That's when we would have been live. We would have been one of the first companies to use the NFT1 standard. It would have been a completely different world had we launched on Chia. I lament that we didn't get the project launched, and it was super disheartening that that we couldn't make it work.
And the product was very, very close to being ready to go. Like everything for infrastructure and platform was there. And, the visible parts, like the user experience, that was all really designed out and just needed implementation. And Grant is not exaggerating saying it could have been launched in Q2, and all of these clubs were clamoring to use this. And when you take a project and say, well, we're just going to rip out this platform completely, you're basically going backwards in your development. And this is why we haven't heard of Bitsports today. Like, where are they now? And it's because you can't develop a product by just trying to continuously rewrite it. You have to go and aim for production. And the best way to aim for production is to look at what you have built out already.
Yeah, when I look at the difficulties that CNI has had to face in the wake of the FTX collapse, Silicon Bank, all of those issues, and also look at the fact that Bitsports did not have success whenever they went to Solana. They're not a name that we recognize today. I really wish that there had been an agreement that was reached. I mean, friction is likely to occur whenever you have a meeting of companies that could have gone differently. The cultivation grant, that could have gone differently. But I really wish that that the leadership of Bitsports had maybe tacked a little more strongly to the decisions that they had made earlier with regards to which blockchain they were going to launch on. When you guys look back at that, what you said, it was 2 weeks, 2 weeks of negotiations between CNI and Bitsports. I know you're not privy to all of the details, but was there any point that, like, the straw that broke the camel's back? What happened in that time?
I think it was in just the entire discussion between the VC senior leadership at Chia and how those negotiations progressed and then ultimately broke down. When you're a startup company, the investors that you bring in early, them continuously participating in follow-on rounds and continuously funding you, it's really important. It's really, really important. If you lose those early VCs, trying to get somebody else to step in and participate in subsequent rounds, it's difficult. I would say, if not insurmountable. So the VCs sort of putting their foot down and saying, you have to go a certain direction or we're not going to stay engaged. That's a difficult place to be put in. And if you don't have some anticipation that you could get a different VC involved, then it's not obvious that you can continue to exist, because when you're a small company and you're a startup and you're not at a point where you're paying for yourself, you need continuous investment and you need multiple different rounds to get you to the point where you're big, you're strong, you're generating your own revenue. And so at this nascent stage, when you're at an early startup, the VC has a lot of say in what you're going to do if they decide they want to put their foot down like this. And they felt so strongly that this hadn't gone well and that things would go very well with Solana. I don't think the VC realized how important Irrelast was in the technological success of Bitsports. Because as soon as we disengaged, their tech team wasn't able to put together the replacement. They weren't able to adapt everything that we had been working on to Solana and do it, in a couple of weeks, which is, I think, what had been sold to Bitsports top leadership, that it would be a quick and easy switch over and that it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But it ended up being much more surmountable hurdle than they had anticipated. So they had to do a lot of work that they just weren't ready to do. And I think at that point, that's when they started to contemplate what would ultimately be the pivot, because they didn't launch something that ended up being a competitor to Socios. And they do continue to exist under a different name, and they're still out there as a company. So they've achieved some level of success, but they pivoted and they're doing something else now. And so even those plans to work with Solana, they didn't work. they didn't come to fruition, and now Bitsports exists in a different form.
And what about CNI? CNI maybe could have courted Bitsports a little earlier, pushed money through the cultivation grant, or made a special deal with a with a project or a client that they thought sort of rose above expectations of other things that were on the table. Did they seem to change their tack when you look at maybe their relationship with Berkeley Compute and Permuto? What do you see that's different? And also with your experience with
I think even the tack that they took with Bitsports, I think at some point they did pull out all the stops. Like they tried everything they could to try and salvage the project and to try to get it funded. Like I really do think that Chia tried hard. Once it became clear that this project really did have some legs to it, that it would potentially not launch on Chia, and that they were going to lose it to Solana. I think that there was a lot of effort put in to try to make it happen, and maybe that was the thing that ultimately was something that was remembered as Berkeley Compute and Permuto came up, is that there are projects that can launch on top of your chain that can drive significant demand and revenue, and that maybe there was a desire not to miss the boat on something that was a big project that could really drive usage and adoption of Chia. So I'm not privy to those internal conversations or how much Bitsports still is remembered inside CNI, but I'd have to imagine that it probably is part of those conversations when they were contemplating things like Berkeley Compute.
Yeah, and my thought on it is, they kind of were trying to pull out all the stops, but it was like very late. And if you work with Chia like on cultivation grants, you quickly see like the culture within CNI is, and it's a culture that works at a lot of corporations where you have a heavy hand in planning and project management, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not really how a startup works. A startup is very agile, and this is what has to be done now. This is what we need to do. Quick move, less meetings. And when you work in a corporate environment, you see a lot of the like, how many people can we do for planning this development? And that was definitely the feeling when interacting with CNI, was it was very corporatized. And that's why I'm not surprised that they were burned through all of their cash from their VCs so quickly, because it's so heavy-handed there, where they can't really quickly change position. And we did see them do that a little bit with Berkeley Compute, but to Grant's point, it was a lot later and they had to kind of learn those lessons.
Well, thank you guys for taking us through the story of Bitsports and what occurred with their relationship with CNI. We're over 40 minutes. Anything else that you want to close us out with? Any thoughts before we close, or Grant, do you want to close this on out?
It was fun to reminisce about the project. I still lament that it didn't launch the way that that everybody had hoped. I think it would have been a completely different world on Chia if we had had a chance to get this thing out the door. Yeah, so it's fun to reminisce about it, and I lament that we didn't get it out. I don't know. There's not much else I can say about it. Yeah, so I guess with that, we'll see you next time on FOMO.
All right, Adam, thanks for coming on. Grant, we'll see you again. Rusty, see y'all later.